My name is Mariam Akhtar-Schuster, and I would like to talk to you about the characteristics of an enabling and policy environment for achieving and maintaining land degradation neutrality. I would briefly like to introduce myself. I work at the Project Management Agency of the German Aerospace Center in Berlin. In fact, not just in Berlin, but right in the center of Berlin at Alexanderplatz. And anybody who knows the Alexanderplatz knows what a busy traffic it has. So this is the area where I have my office. And I would like to point out to you my biography a bit more in detail so that you understand why a person who is so urbanly fixed and located talks about land. I did my major field work in North Africa and in Southern Africa on the topics of land degradation, desertification, and drought. And I worked very intensively together with nomadic tribes in Sudan and also with communal land users in Namibia and in South Africa. So many of the pictures you will be seeing originate from these areas. My work actually gravitated more and more towards science policy work already during my field work. And so it was more or less quite a natural step for me to start working with the United Nations Convention on Desertification and start leading its ad hoc groups on how science can be provided to the UN conventions and especially to the UNCCD. I also chaired several of these UNCCD ad hoc scientific groups. And one of these groups also developed the conceptual framework for land degradation neutrality. And this is the reason why I'm going to talk to you about land today. It may also interest you to know that I also work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where I'm an external independent scientific reviewer, and that I also coordinate national activities for my country, Germany, on biodiversity and ecosystems within the framework of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, which was also established just a few years ago. So this is the reason why I'm talking to you today about land degradation neutrality. Talking about land degradation neutrality immediately brings to our mind what is actually meant by neutrality. And in order to understand the term neutrality, it would be important to look into the Sustainable Development Goals. And you know that in 2015, several Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the UN. And one of these Sustainable Development Goals, it's Goal 15, has a target which reads, by 2030, combat desertification and restore degraded land and soil, including land affected by desertification, drought, and floods, and strive to achieve a land degradation neutral world. So immediately after adoption of these Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Convention realized how important it is now to find a definition for neutrality in order to be able to help countries in developing measures to implement neutrality at national levels. So in 2015, just a few weeks after the UN had adopted its Sustainable Development Goals, the UNCCD officially defined land degradation neutrality as a state whereby the amount and quality of land resources necessary to support ecosystem functions and services and enhance food security remain stable or increase within specified temporal and spatial scales and ecosystems. So the moment this official definition had been adopted by the UNCCD, the science policy of the interface of the UNCCD was requested by the member countries of the UNCCD to develop a conceptual framework for land degradation neutrality in order to support countries in their efforts to implement land degradation neutrality at country level. And I co-chaired this group that developed this conceptual framework for land degradation neutrality, which I will be presenting to you in a short while. I would now like to start off by providing you the storyline of my talk, and it will start off by giving you a basic understanding of what the neutrality concept means, because it will be important to understand this neutrality concept in order to develop an enabling policy environment for achieving and maintaining land degradation neutrality. So after having basically understood what neutrality means, we will go into the issue of identifying challenges for achieving land degradation neutrality at country level. And I will be presenting some country examples to you, which are emerging. And the identification of these challenges will be important to start proposing policies and procedures which may support the development of an enabling environment for implementing land degradation neutrality at country level. And finally, I will be giving you an outline about how to develop synergies in action and complementary actions at national level, so that countries don't just have to focus on developing policies and procedures for land degradation neutrality, but if they see the advantages emerging out of land degradation neutrality for other national aspirations like conservation of biodiversity, adaptation to climate change, this will provide countries a better feeling and better cost efficiency in the implementation of measures to implement land degradation neutrality. So the concept of neutrality is an important issue which needs to be understood if we want to discuss an enabling policy environment. Neutrality, as defined by the Science Policy Interface of the UNCCD, and as you can see in this graph, shows that new land degradation needs to be counterbalanced through planned positive actions elsewhere. This counterbalancing will lead to a level basis, which means that productive land is not lost. So there will be no net loss in productive lands. And there is a set of measures or a hierarchy of measures to enable achieving this no net loss, this neutrality. So on the one hand, you have, and this is the main issue, you have measures to avoid land degradation. This is the first major issue policies need to consider. The second very important issue is how to reduce the effects of land use and thus of land degradation. This can be achieved, for instance, by sustainable land management practices. And thirdly, what will probably be most costly will be reversing existing land degradation by rehabilitation and restoration measures. With these three sets of measures, policymakers will have tools in their hands, if they have the right procedures in place, to acquire a land degradation neutral state in their country. One very important issue is that you cannot neutralize, for instance, land degradation, the deforestation of an area by reversing land degradation in meadows or in grazing lands. So the principle of attaining this land degradation neutrality is based on the like-for-like basis. So if you, for instance, have to degrade forests to develop infrastructure, you, on the other hand, will have to reverse land degradation in already degraded forest lands. This is the like-for-like principle, which is very, very important and needs to be considered at the national level. And it also means that policymakers will need a whole set of monitoring system in order to monitor any changes, any progress which they initiate in order to achieve land degradation neutrality. One issue which is very important, and this was outlined by the project on the economics of land degradation, is the fact that avoiding land degradation in the first place is probably more cost effective and more cost efficient than in the end trying to reverse land degradation, which will be a really costly matter. And this needs to be considered, especially by countries which do not have such a high economic stability or availability of funds, to maybe look more into measures to avoid land degradation in the first place. So all in all, one can say that avoiding and measures to avoid and to reduce land degradation will lead to the reduction of land degradation. Reversing land degradation, on the other hand, will lead to gaining a new productive lands. And this will ultimately and can ultimately support countries in achieving land degradation neutrality in their boundaries. So based on the description of what the land degradation neutrality framework looks like, the question is, what is exactly needed in order to develop an enabling policy environment? Measures which were characterized by me as avoiding land degradation, reducing land degradation, and reversing land degradation have to be permanently integrated into a country's national policy setting for sustainable development. And I would really like to underscore the term permanently. It will be a long-term initiative every country will have to deal with. The other thing is that it's not only about achieving land degradation, it is also about maintaining land degradation neutrality. And this means that policies have to be in place to enable over decades measures and guidance in order to support the control of how the land is being used and also to report on it. This will mean that we will need procedures at the national level which implement national policies describing land degradation neutrality. And these procedures will have to enable a day-to-day operationalization of the policies which have been described and adopted by a country. And finally, what we also need is a reporting process at the national level. We need to know how the processes, how the measures to avoid, reduce, and reverse land degradation, how these measures really work on the ground, whether they need to be re-engineered, whether they really support all the different groups in society in providing benefits for their livelihoods and for their security. And this reporting process will also support possibilities to see how land degradation measures also support a country in achieving its other national aspirations. So land is extremely central in addressing a number of sustainable development challenges which have been defined by the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have a sustainable development goal on reducing poverty. We have a sustainable development goals on combating hunger. We have a sustainable development goal number 6 on water and sanitation. We have a sustainable development goal on action, on climate actions, and so on. All these different sustainable development goals will extremely benefit from having a land degradation neutrality measure implemented, but any policies which are developed have to reflect the multi-benefits which measures to attain land degradation neutrality also pose to these other sustainable development goals. And Professor Lindsay Stringer from the University of Leeds will be providing you more details on this in her presentation. You can see that based on these different issues like no poverty, zero hunger, etc., all these sustainable development goals have different priorities in different countries. And this already indicates to you that developing measures for achieving and maintaining land degradation neutrality can never be a one-size-fits-all project. Every country will have to define its own challenges. It will also have to define its own opportunities which emerge from implementing land degradation neutrality. And because of the multifarious bouquet of possibilities and challenges which exist in each country, policy will really have to consider science in the development of planning mechanisms to implement land degradation neutrality at the landscape level at least. And this is really important to consider. So we need science in the policy, guiding policy issues and providing options on how to develop land use planning, integrated land use planning at the national level and most appropriately at the landscape level in a country. And since 2015, we already have 14 country reports from across the world which outline challenges for policies which are already now becoming visible. And I think that looking into these already existing challenges which are emerging for the implementation of land degradation neutrality, we need to look into these challenges in order to provide options and to see what we can do in order to develop an enabling environment. So in the next step, I would like to inform you about some of these challenges. And here I have generalized them into 5 points. So the first challenge I would like to outline is a lacking national vision to achieve land degradation neutrality. This lacking national vision usually occurs if a country has not doesn't have the knowledge what the term neutrality implies and what implications land degradation neutrality as such has. If the issue of land degradation neutrality is not completely understood at the policy level, then trade-offs can emerge. And this is a very serious issue because countries will not be able to see that implementing land degradation neutrality measures like avoiding, reducing, and reversing land degradation can also provide synergies in actions and help achieving other national aspirations like poverty reduction, like food security. And if this is not understood, that there is a really an interlinkage between achieving land degradation neutrality and other national aspirations, this can lead to trade-offs, for instance, budget constraints. Money is pushed into land degradation neutrality initiatives and other national aspirations might suffer because one does not see the linkages between these different goals at national level which one is trying to achieve. The second issue is that inadequate policy principles and rules exist. And this can be quite a difficult issue to be handled because often there is a lack of knowledge at the policy in governments and also in their subsidiary authorities on what knowledge is needed to implement land degradation neutrality. You need special indicators, you need tools, you need reporting systems, and these aspects which are often missing. And they are further aggravated by the fact that we have existing policy principles and rules which severely hamper achieving land degradation neutralities. And these are the so-called failures of the past. For instance, when it comes to trade issues, we have, at national level, there are trading aspects between countries. the so-called telecoupling, where socioeconomic and environmental interlinkages exist between different countries, which influence the production and the flow of goods between countries. So it may be interesting for you to look into the issue of telecoupling, which is becoming more and more important in discussions when we talk about sustainable use of lands. And telecoupling is a word we can find more and more often at the science policy interfaces. The other issue is land insecurity as such. Land insecurity happens due to the fact that there are no clear land tenure mechanisms, no land tenure rights or insufficient land tenure rights. There's no land registration acts in place. This is basically a problem affecting many developing countries, because developing a land registration act is quite a cumbersome method, and you need to have a digital background to do that work. However, if land insecurity exists, then mostly farmers do not have the incentives in many countries and in regions. They just don't have the incentives to invest in sustainable land management. And therefore, this is really an issue for achieving land degradation neutrality. On the other hand, it is really clear that it is also a very sensitive issue at the national level. Then we have the whole issue about changes in legislations and institutional structures. Many countries frequently change their legislations. This does not give any planning security and can hamper the implementation of land degradation neutrality gains. And finally, and most importantly, we have a lack of funds in many countries which deal with land degradation, which have to deal with land degradation. So this is a real challenge, and it really needs to be addressed at the policy level, and mechanisms have to be found in order to support funding, long-term funding. In fact, it will be funding, it may even be a permanent funding issue. So as already outlined, what we need to achieve in order to develop an enabling policy environment for achieving land degradation neutrality is that we have to permanently establish certain measures in policies, and we also have to ensure that there's a permanent budget for these activities. And this will require the formulation and adoption of principles to motivate government sectors and all sectors of societies, in fact, to support measures to achieve land degradation neutrality. We will have to formulate rules at the policy level to regulate and transform land towards sustainable management practices. And policies will also have to include guidelines which direct the long-term future course of action to achieve and to maintain the national vision for sustainable development, which is based on land degradation neutrality, but which also considers achieving zero hunger, poverty reduction, etc. And lastly, we need to formulate guidelines to direct the long-term future course of actions to achieve and to maintain the national vision for sustainable development. And this can only be achieved if these guidelines show the direct link between measures to attaining land degradation neutrality with zero hunger, poverty reduction, biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. And only then can a sustainable development vision of a country really be supported by land degradation neutrality measures. So based on this, it already outlines that there is a need to mainstream principles, rules, and guidelines, which I had just outlined, in a way that it becomes a shared national understanding and vision. And such mainstreaming of principles, rules, and guidelines into national policies can contribute to the broader national sustainable development aspirations. Mainstreaming of principles, rules, and guidelines can promote synergies in action to address issues connected to land, like I had just mentioned, poverty reduction, enhancing food security. Mainstreaming can provide a foundation for evaluating international policies and initiatives that influence national land use, for instance, production mechanisms, consumption mechanisms, trade links, etc. And mainstreaming can also support the allocation of resources in state budgets. And I think in this case, it should also be ensured that many countries will also require external support due to limited state budgets. And policy, in its work on mainstreaming land degradation neutrality, should also consider how it can attract external resources as a support. After all, we are talking about a permanent issue. Even if you have achieved land degradation neutrality, you have to see how and have to seek ways in order to maintain land degradation neutrality. And finally, mainstreaming principles, rules, and guidelines can also support amendments to existing policies and legal frameworks. As I had already indicated, in many countries you have the so-called failures of the past in existing land use practices and regulations, and these need to be amended, and they can best be amended if governments across all sectors, if authorities, but most importantly, if also population understands the reason why it is important to achieve land degradation neutrality and to maintain this state. Now, I had pointed out that it's a nice to have such enabling policies, but they will not be very useful if the right procedures are missing to implement these policies at a day-to-day level. So we need these procedures which implement land degradation measures, because governments will just provide the policies. But the implementation is often undertaken by subsidiary authorities, other institutions at the subnational and local level. And these procedures have to be in place to provide the tools. And procedures in many countries are missing, and this is what the country reports, which I had previously mentioned, already outline, that there is, for instance, one inadequate procedural issue is lacking personnel and financial resources, especially also in government-led institutions, in order to develop the right procedures. There is a lacking knowledge about what land degradation neutrality means and how it can be implemented. So the indicators are not known in order to measure land degradation and also to report on the progress of any measures which are implemented in order to achieve land degradation neutrality. And there might even be entire technical systems, for instance, for monitoring, long-term monitoring of the status of land, which are not there, and where there is also limited knowledge on how such technical systems should look like. And then another issue is that there's often a poor coordination among authorities because they don't talk to each other. They're totally unconnected. And in some cases, they even have overlapping mandates, which again leads to misunderstandings and conflicts. And this also needs to be sorted out in order to provide the right procedures. And finally, as already outlined earlier, there could also be the issue of state budget. On the one hand, policies have to see that the state budget has to include money for land degradation neutrality measures. But on the other hand, there might also be an inability at the procedural level on how to use the state budget. So there could be a limited tendering process which limits the correct use of the state budget. There could also be the issue that there is an unrealistic assumption of how costly a mechanism is to implement land degradation. So we need knowledge also here in order to ensure that the state budget, which has been allocated for land degradation neutrality measures, is properly used. And only with such proper use will there also be the trust and the transparencies to provide future budget, to ensure future budgets for land degradation neutrality measures. So what do strong procedures have to look like that express policies in day-to-day operations? So strong procedures will definitely benefit from a setup which enables the correct implementation of measures to avoid, reduce, and reverse land degradation. Procedures have to consider monitoring aspects, and there you can maybe already see how closely even procedural aspects have to be developed in dialogue with science and also with other knowledge holders, especially also with land users. Then procedures have to enable the counterbalancing of anticipated net losses by planning additional gains elsewhere in order to ensure that no net loss of productive land takes place. And finally, procedures also have to consider the interplay between used and unused ecosystems. This is extremely important also for the issue of the conservation of biodiversity and connecting this to land degradation neutrality issues. Secondly, we need to strengthen administrations that secure land tenure and land registration. So procedures have to be in place for these both aspects, because it will finally be the security which is given to land users which will enable them, or which will provide an incentive for them to invest in sustainable management practices. And then in order to enable a coordinated implementation of measures to operationalize land degradation neutrality, it could be important for a country to consider establishing a lead authorized national entity that coordinates national actors to achieve and to maintain land degradation neutrality. And this could be, for instance, such a national authorized entity could, for instance, be charged with the development of national awareness raising programs, continuous national awareness raising programs, not only across government sectors and authorities, but also going into society and looking into different sections of society, and especially also the more vulnerable groups in societies, because after all, you know that the Sustainable Development Goals should not leave anybody behind. This is a slogan which is used, and so you will need to look into all sections of society, make them aware of the fact what is land degradation neutrality, what measures have to be implemented in order to achieve land degradation neutrality. Then such a lead authorized national entity could also monitor the use of national and international resources. On the long term, this will provide the transparency and the security also for international funders to provide money, because they can see how the money is being used by a country. And then very, very important, a very important factor is that there is a lot of knowledge which is still missing on how to implement land degradation neutrality. After all, it is a new vision which just emerged in 2015, as I had pointed out earlier. And it's just 2 years old, and so it needs more and more knowledge in order to facilitate its implementation. And because there is a no one-size-fits-all solution to achieving land degradation neutrality, scientists will have to look into countries, into specific socioeconomic conditions, environmental conditions, and policy development aspirations of each country, and see how to develop a best fit at country level. And this is why we will be needing science that should accompany the development of an enabling policy environment. And then finally, such a lead authorized entity could replicate its success stories, which emerge from national level implementation of land degradation neutrality, and provide success stories, but even lessons learned to their regions, to their neighboring countries, and also develop a dialogue and cooperation between countries at the regional level to come together in order to achieve land degradation neutrality. A very important issue, which I had already signaled, is the issue of leaving no one behind. And I think that such a lead authorized national entity would really need to develop links to local officials, to local decision makers, to civil society organizations, and to existing multi-stakeholder platforms and even the private sector, to involve them in the development and in the implementation of procedures to achieving land degradation neutrality. Only if this is achieved, this multi-stakeholder involvement, can we ensure that the different interests and the different needs of the different sections of society are considered on time in the development of procedures and in the implementation of measures to achieving land degradation neutrality. And this may even, on the long run, support avoiding any conflicts emerging from measures to attaining land degradation neutrality, because the different sectors of society know we are part of the process, we co-developed these measures. And a very important issue, especially for developing countries, but also for economically more advanced countries, is the issue of the long-term monitoring of the progress of achieving and maintaining land degradation neutrality. Monitoring, as you all know, is an extremely costly affair. And there is lots of local knowledge, even traditional knowledge, which exists in local communities, and it would be very beneficial if these people who actually use the land are involved in monitoring processes to support any measures to see what the status of the land looks like, whether it's developing in a more negative direction, or whether the land productivity is maintained, or whether it's even being enhanced. Because finally, it is the land users who are perceived as those who cause land degradation due to their activities. But the land degradation neutrality measure clearly highlights the fact that land users are actually the solution. Because if they cause the problem, then they should be seen as those who can also solve the problem. So they should be included in procedural day-to-day operation. And you will now see a set of photos showing young people who work in Namibia and in South Africa together with scientists, and who are trained in using indicators to see and record and monitor the progress or the status of their lands. And by including young people into these measures, provides them with enhanced knowledge on the one hand. They get further trained on how to cope with their land. On the other hand, it's not a one-way knowledge transfer. Scientists and decision makers who work with such young people and community members learn a lot from these people about their needs, and also about their local knowledge which exists on plants, on soil, etc. And what is even more important is the fact that by including these people, we automatically have the most vulnerable groups in procedures to monitor and the progress of land degradation measures which have been implemented, and also to support measures to report on the status of the land, which is very important as well. So after indicating what procedures may have to look like in order to support policies, I would now like to come to my final point, and this is about how to create synergistic and complementary national actions to achieving land degradation neutrality. Because as pointed out at several sections of my talk, it is important to have coordination of national actions, and these can strengthen the country's efforts to achieve land degradation neutrality by avoiding trade-offs and also supporting cost efficiency of national actions, because national actions will support several national aspirations. Secondly, coordinated national actions can also support a country's obligations and its national contributions to international environmental agreements, such as the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. It was the Rio summit in 1992, which had outlined that it is land degradation, desertification, biodiversity loss, and climate change, which are the most severe constraints for national development. And by implementing a more coordinated way of dealing with land degradation neutrality measures, these issues can all be handled. And finally, national reporting to the international strategies for sustainable development can be supported by coordinating national activities. And so this is another benefit which is emerging and which will provide countries' success stories and lessons learned through the wider global community working on achieving land degradation neutrality. Because we are not talking about a goal to achieving a land degradation neutral country by 2030, we are talking about achieving a land degradation neutral world by 2030. And this means that there has to be communication and cooperation between countries. Now, as indicated already, this whole work on developing an enabling environment, policy environment for achieving and maintaining land degradation neutrality is really a new progress. It is work in progress. And so the science policy interface of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification is currently working on a refined guidance to support national activities related to land degradation neutrality. And you can find more information on what is going on in a special issue which will be emerging by the end of this year in the Environmental Science and Policy Journal. And there you can find an article also by myself with some very esteemed colleagues on the issue of science policy interfaces from the UNCCD to national implementation. So if you are really interested in this work, I very much support you to stay in touch with the work of the science policy interface of the UNCCD, and you will find a lot of the work going on the website. And with this, I would like to thank you for your interest, and I would especially like to thank you for taking part in this massive open online consultation process on land matters. Thank you.